When facing society, the man most concerned, the man who is to do the most and contribute the most, has the least say. It's taken for granted that he has no voice, and the reasons he could offer are rejected in advance as prejudiced, since no speech is ever considered, but only the speaker. So that's a quote that I really like from Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, which is one of the books that I'm going to review this week. So come and join me and find out what I thought of it. Hi, welcome back to Bookish Brummy. My name is Mel and I like to review books. So in today's video we're going to review 4 books today. So they are books that I've read throughout the month of July that haven't really neatly fit into a category. And plus I've been really busy this month, so I've been struggling to sort of pick topics to read around and get that done in exactly 7 days. So these books have been read over the course of the month and not all just in the last week. So I have quite a range of things to talk to you about, to be honest. The first one I'm going to talk about is a book called Tilt by Emma Pattee. Now, this is Emma Pattee's debut novel. This came out last year in 2025. I was not aware of it. It actually came up on my Amazon and it was like a discounted price for the hardback. So it wasn't too expensive. And I've got to be honest, this was a cover buy. I really like raccoons. It's got a raccoon on the cover. So I read the blurb and I thought the blurb sounded interesting. Now, we are following our main character, Annie, and she lives in Portland and she's really heavily pregnant, literally about a week away from giving birth. And she's in IKEA, she's trying to buy last minute things that she needs, and this big, massive earthquake rocks Portland. And the IKEA that she's in is basically falling down around her. So she escapes out of that. And her first thought is that she needs to get to her husband and she needs to see that he's okay and then that they can go home together. But, you know, he's meant to be at home, I think. Anyway, she then discovers that no, not at home, sorry. He's meant to be at work, but he actually has 2 places of work. And the place of work that she thinks he's in, he's actually not in that one. He's in the other one, which is much further away from where she is. So she sets out on a mission basically to get to her husband. And as we're following her through this journey, I think this journey is going on over about a 24-hour period and no longer. But, you know, it's all the people that she encounters that have also, you know, either been hurt by the earthquake or displaced by the earthquake. Some really shocking scenes, as you would expect. But she is also sort of thinking about her life since she became pregnant and then also her life before she was pregnant. So she's sort of talking about, like, you know, her fears that she has about having a child, her excitements about having a child, and then what her life was like, you know, before she was actually pregnant, before she actually planned to have children. And I think that that's quite interesting. If you've had children, I think that you may really sort of buy into this novel and really understand what she's talking about. I personally sort of struggled with this novel a little bit. I thought that the bits where she was talking about, you know, what she thought her life was going to be like without children before she'd even decided to have children. I thought those bits were really poignant. And then when she sort of, I don't know, in a way talking about the loss almost of what she's not going to have in her life, like when she finally has a child, I thought that was really poignant. And I did really like that. But what I struggled with was this character's likability on the whole. I just didn't really like her. I didn't think that she was particularly that nice to the people around her. I know she was in a stressful situation, but I think, you know, even before this started, like before the earthquake actually started, maybe she wasn't the nicest of people the way she came across. But I really don't like the way that she talks about her husband either. She seems to hold him in absolute utter contempt throughout this book, and I'm sort of struggling to understand why she's trying so hard to get to him when she really doesn't seem to like him. I have to admit as well, I thought the ending to this story was kind of disappointing. I just thought it could have been better. Overall, this is like it's an easily bingeable read. You could read this in a day or 2. It's not really that difficult. You know, it has the element of what's going to happen next constantly because we're in a sort of disaster situation that's unfolding over the 24 hours. So yeah, it's easy to get through and easy to read. But yeah, I just didn't really like the main character, didn't really like the way she thought about her husband, and I didn't really like the ending. So I've got to be honest, like, this wasn't the best, but I can't really expect it to be the best for my taste when I basically picked the book because of the cover. Haven't we all done that before? But essentially I would give this a 2.75. I think, you know, I would potentially read another book if this author brought it out. I'm not against it. I should imagine that, you know, if we've got a different character set, that would be fine. I felt the way she, you know, unfolded the disaster was good. So yeah, let me know if you've read this one and what you thought of it. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is a book that I really wanted to read for a long time, and then my book club decided that they were going to pick it to read it. So it was Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. So I've had this on my shelf for some months now, and basically on the list for the BBC's list for the top British novels of all time, there's like 2 Mrs. Dalloways in the top 5, and 2 Virginia Woolf novels in the top 5, sorry, and Mrs. Dalloway is one of them. And then in the recent Guardian's list of 100 top novels of all time, pretty much everything that Virginia Woolf has ever written seems to be in that list. And I had never read anything by Virginia Woolf before, so I was really, really excited to get into this one. So this was published in 1925. I'm not going to keep holding it up because, as you can see, the light ring is shining off and it's a bit annoying, but yeah. This was published in 1925, and it's set in London in around about the year 1923 on one day. And it follows our character, Mrs. Dalloway, and she's preparing for a party that she's going to have at her house that evening. Now, I was sort of under the impression that this book would be following Mrs. Dalloway for the entirety of it, because it's not, you know, it's not a particularly long book, but it's not really. Like, we start off at the beginning with Mrs. Dalloway sort of talking about some of the arrangements that she's going to make for the party and reflecting on some of her relationships with some of the people that we assume are coming to the party, and sort of reflecting on, you know, how far she's come since she was a young girl, and, you know, who she's been in love with over the years. But then we switch to other characters in the story who are basically coming to the party later on, and they're reflecting on their lives, and in part like what their relationship with Mrs. Dalloway has been over the years, but not necessarily that. So we have a really interesting cast of characters in here. And I think one of the most interesting characters for me is one called Septimus. Now, Septimus clearly has issues from having been in World War One. He seems to have some kind of PST or shell shock, and he's basically, you know, come home and he's really, really, really struggling with his life. And, you know, the way that the sort of mental health care was then, you know, it wasn't as understanding as it was today, and obviously you know, they just didn't have the same methods to be able to help people, or the same knowledge about these post-war conditions. So, you know, his wife, who is from abroad, has basically landed in this country with her husband, and now her husband kind of acts like a vegetable, doesn't even manage to have full conversations with her a lot of the time because he's so locked in his own head. And, you know, the medical professionals, he's actually very rich, so he can afford like the best London street doctors, but, you know, they just want to shove him off into the countryside and, you know, away from his wife, and have him have some peaceful, quiet time. But there's not really any discussion about what kind of talking therapies or other kind of therapies that he may go through to recover. So he's really against the idea of, you know, leaving London, leaving his wife, and his wife's not too happy about, you know, the idea of him going away. So we have this sort of relationship going on between them, where we see into their experience of each other in the present, of what's going on over this day, and then reflecting on, well, that the wife is reflecting on her relationship with Septimus and how much he's changed, and I think like how much she misses him. And I think that these particular character set is really, really important in this novel, because it's obviously post the Great War. And I also think that with it being written in 1925, and the lack of knowledge that they did have back then about, you know, post-war syndromes, I think it was actually really clever that Virginia Woolf wrote this character in the way that she did. Like, she really showed a huge depth of understanding for a character in that situation. So that was one of the things that I really liked about this book. Then, you know, there's a lot of other characters, and you know, they talk about varying parts of their life, and interestingly, Septimus doesn't attend the party, but the rest of the characters are attending the party. So Septimus doesn't know Mrs. Dalloway, but the other characters know Septimus. So there's a bit of a link that's basically caused between these characters, and I can't go too much into why that's interesting, because I don't want to basically spoil the story for people if they should want to read it. But basically, we then get to the party at the end of the day. A couple of big events have happened, and our characters are now reflecting on that event now they're at the party. And it's the first time where they're all actually in a room and able to talk to each other. So we see them, in their own little worlds, like in their relationships, maybe as a couple, but not with all the other couples around them, or individually, but not with any of the other individual people, until we get to the party at the end, and then they all kind of slot in together. And then we sort of see the active relationship that they have with each other and Mrs. Dalloway, and that's really interesting. And what I find, really interesting about this book, I think that the whole unfolding over the day of the story, to be honest, it's a bit boring. Like there's no major event going on here. It's all about how people feel, and their emotions, and how they sort of connect with each other. So this is more of like a character discovery novel. But what I find really interesting is the actual range of human experience and human emotion that's actually portrayed with these characters. Absolutely fascinating. And I think that depression is spoken about quite a lot in this book, and I would, say that as a trigger warning. If you're a bit not really wanting to read about the idea of depression or suicide or things like that, this is probably not going to be the book for you. Now, Virginia Woolf did actually take her own life in the 1943 or 1944, I think, so a good 20 years after this novel was published. But you see a lot of the discussions in the emotional makeup of these characters, and how they sort of think about their life, and they're thinking about their existence, and what they've lost in life, what they hope to gain, or what they think they're never going to gain. I think a lot of that conversation comes from the mind of somebody who is suffering depression, or who has suffered depression and really understands that, because that's what I felt like I got out of these characters. So for me, I felt like there was a bit of Virginia Woolf in every single one of these characters. I felt like she was writing bits of her experience and weaving it into every single one of them, not just Mrs. Dalloway. And I don't think that, had I read this book without the insight that she had took her own life, I don't think I would have understood that when I read this book. But the fact that I sort of read up on her prior to reading this novel and understood that about her made me read this book with a different lens, I think. And so to me, this was actually a really, really poignant novel. To me, this felt like Virginia Woolf absolutely spilling her heart out across various different characters as to how she felt in the world. Now, my interpretation of this book was quite different from people in my book group. A lot of people in my book group didn't read this book with that sort of particular lens, in the way that I did. And they didn't necessarily enjoy this book as much, or see that kind of depth in the characters. There were a couple of times where they felt like actually the main character, Mrs. Dalloway, was a bit cold, a bit unfeeling. But when we actually spoke about it from the point of view as, well, actually, if you think of Mrs. Dalloway as actually being quite depressed, and reframe the way that you're looking at her, maybe that character would grow on you a little bit, make a bit more sense, make you understand like maybe why she's looking at the world like that. So that was a really interesting discussion, I think, that we had in my book group. Now, the other thing that we discussed, and I kind of noticed when I first started reading this is really chaotic in the way that it's written. At times there's a bit like a stream of consciousness, and it sort of like jumps about, and there's no chapters. There's random page breaks in places where you're not really expecting there to be. And again, like if you really look at the sort of state of mind that I think Virginia Woolf might have been in, at the time of her probably writing this book, that actually might account for why this is so chaotic. But if we also consider that all the characters in this book kind of representing depression in some kind of a way or another, again leads to kind of like, well, maybe the chaotic nature of the book is representing that. That was the theory anyway. But I found that a little bit difficult to get on with when I first got into this book. But I think after I'd got through about 20 pages, I sort of wrapped my head around it, and then I was all right with it, although other people weren't necessarily. And I think this book has gone up in my estimation over the weeks after I finished it. So this was one of the first things I actually read in July, and I think when I came out of the book, I was thinking, that's about a 3.5 when I started the book, and then I finished. I thought it was always about 3.75. By the time I got to book group and had a really good think about it, then it had gone up to a 4. But now I've had some more time to think about it. I actually think I would rate this a 4.25. It's definitely grown on me. You know, for something that's like just over 170 pages long, it really packs a punch, I think. So yeah, I'm actually really looking forward to reading more Virginia Woolf. If you've read this one, again, please let me know in the comments down below what you thought of it. So, and the next book I'm going to talk about is a really, really sweet book. It is Return to the Dallergut Dream Department Store by Miye, and this is translated by Sandy Dewsome Lee. Now, I read the first book in this duology back in March, which is the Dallergut Dream Department Store, and it was the first time I'd ever read a book like this. I don't think I've ever read anything like this duology, if I'm honest. But I just really, really like it. It's obviously fantasy, but it's really cozy fantasy. There's nothing like too dramatic or traumatic going on in it. The world building is really interesting, and I kind of said after I'd read the first one that if you really sit down and think about the world that's being built, there's a lot of holes in it and it doesn't really make sense. And I left that book thinking I can't work out if the dream department store that our main character works in, I can't work out if the people, like the customers who visit it, are awake or asleep. I was a little bit confused about that. This book has actually cleared that up somewhat. It seems that they are actually asleep when they visit the department store, so I'm glad that question got answered. But this was published in Korea in 2021, and then it finally got translated by Sandy in 2024. So we've had this in the UK since 2024. I bought my copy from Book 66 a few months ago. So instead of it costing me £10, it cost me about £3. Now, I'd say that that's important because what I'm about to say about this book is, yeah, I enjoy this duology. It's really cozy, it's really nice. You can easily sit before you go to bed with a cup of tea, read this book, and feel really kind of warm, cozy, safe with this book. And I really, really like that. I feel like it's a duology that I definitely keep on my shelf. And anytime I want to do some reading where I don't have to use too much brain power, this would be a nice book, you know. And there's nothing in it at all that's upsetting. There's nothing in it that would elicit a trigger warning at all. And all of the characters are just so nice to each other. I think there's one line in here which kind of pointed towards some kind of innuendo towards sex. And it was so light you could almost miss it. But that's, yeah, this is just, you know, this book is not gritty. There's no sex in it in any way. The characters are all really wholesome. Nobody swears. Everybody gets on with each other. Everybody gets on with the boss and the managers at the department store. Yeah, it's really nice. So the first book starts off with our main character Penny, and she has started working at this dream department store, which is essentially what it is, a department store that sells dreams to people who come in while they're sleeping, and then they buy these dreams. This book is a year after she has been in her role, and basically she's passed her probation, I guess you would call it, and she's now allowed into like the main dream district, which you have to get a train to go to. And in that main dream district, there is like the complaint centre, so where people go to lodge complaints, and then there's also like a factory where they're kind of trialing out different dreams, and different dream makers go there to you know, pick up ingredients and make their dreams and things like that. So that's really interesting because it kind of expanded the world a little bit bigger than just the department store that you kind of in the first book. So this one you can actually go out with the characters somewhere else. But one of the things that I feel like was a little bit of a disappointment for me in this was talking about how she was basically going to go to the complaint centre and work at the complaint centre, but I feel like the time spent in the complaint centre is absolutely minimal, barely anything. And I thought that, you know, on the whole, she'd be dealing with some pretty big, heavy complaints, but the complaints were just so, I don't know, like there's no conflict whatsoever. There was really no conflict for her to have to sort out. And I did feel like the complaints that she kind of had to take away with her to look at, they weren't really actually major complaints. So I feel like that this book does tell you that she's going to go and work at the complaint centre, but she doesn't really. She just goes there for one afternoon and gets given a couple of complaints that she's told to basically go and sort out, which, you know, inevitably she does. So yeah, that was a bit of disappointment. But then on the whole, when I think about this series, as I said, this series is completely no conflict. So to be honest, I probably should have expected that nothing major was going to happen in that area. I think on the whole, I really do like this world. I enjoyed book 1 and 2, but I don't think I'd be bothered to read a third book if it came out. And I just think that that's because now it's probably run out of steam. The world has been introduced and then it's been grown slightly. We've got to know some of the characters, and that's all really nice. But unless you can now begin to insert some conflict into this world or this story, I don't think there's anywhere else for it to go. I think we've described everything in the world that we can and built all the friendships that we can. So yeah, I think the only way to revisit this would be to change, you know, the approach to this slightly and introduce some conflict. So I'm quite happy now that this is the final one as far as I'm aware. Miye has written something else since, which was nothing to do with this, so I don't think she's intending on returning to this anytime soon. On the whole, I would give this a 3-star. Yeah, it's a nice, cozy fantasy read about selling people dreams, but there's nothing really to get your teeth into. This is a filler book between one serious book and the next serious book that you're going to read, or just something nice and light before bedtime. So if you have read this duology, like if you've completed it now, again, let me know in the comments what you think down below. Okay, so the final book I'm going to talk about was a bit of a surprise to me. I didn't think I was going to read it this month. So this is Ayn Rand, The Fountainhead. So Ayn Rand is a Russian American. She was born in Russia at the turn of the 20th century, I believe, and then she emigrated out to America. And her work is underpinned a lot by a philosophy that she came up with of objectivism. And objectivism is in direct contrast to collectivism and the idea of communism. So we can see, having come out of Russia at a time when Russia had gone from being an autocracy to a communist country, or a socialist country building into a communist country, she would have actually been present during that time. So being present at that time has affected her way of looking at politics and looking at life. And so throughout all of her writings, this idea of objectivism is embraced by her. Her books are obviously not published in Russia, they're published in America, and this one was published in 1943. Now, the story starts off actually in the 1920s, so again, another post-Great War novel. And we are following, well, the book is split into four parts, and we're following 4 characters. So we have Peter Keating and Howard Rourke are 2 characters, and they both went to school together. And Peter graduates as an architect, and Howard doesn't graduate, but he is known as a fantastic architect. And throughout the book, well, I say they're against each other. Howard is in competition. Peter, is in competition with Howard to be the best architect. And the way that society looks on both of them is completely different. So Howard really symbolises the idea of a character who is following objectivist principles. He doesn't want to change himself for anything or for anybody. He believes in totally being himself, doing the work that he does for himself and not for other people. So if he designs a building, the idea is he's designed it, that is the way that it's going to be built, and it's his art, it's the craft that he has done, it's what he has given to the world, it's what he has created, and he will not allow anybody else to come in and change the plans in any way whatsoever. He will not compromise, and if he's asked to be compromised with, he basically won't take on the project. He will just tell them to get somebody else to design it. And this is the way that he lives his life. He does not compromise with anybody else. He lives for himself. Now, Peter is a little bit in the way of, he designs things and he wants to sell his work on, but obviously in order to get on in life, a lot of the time that we have to make compromises and we have to collaborate with other people. So he does what he has to do to basically climb up the greasy pole to the top of the profession, and basically he gets up there quite shamelessly over the years. And the two men have very, very different outcomes in their careers, considering the different ways they have of looking at it. We then also follow the owner of the main newspaper at the time. And so again, he has come from nothing, wants to do what he wants to do, and he basically sells his papers to the masses and gives them whatever they want. He will tear anybody down or pull anybody up at any point in his newspapers at a whim, depending on what the public want. So in his newspapers, obviously, we have a lot of discussion about the architecture that's being built at the time and who's building it and the kind of dramas that are going on in that world. And then the fourth person we're following is one of the writers for that paper, and he believes in collectivism, and he believes in the good of altruism and everybody doing everything for the sake of everybody else in mankind and not really following the self or his self. So he's like a complete contrast to how Howard Rourke would actually live his life. So again, like, we also following the careers of these two men, the newspaper owner and the reporter for that newspaper, and how they kind of fit into the society that they're in. And I think that all four stories that are being told sort of just show how, as a society, we shape each other and how society decides on the next trend and who is going to be accepted, who isn't accepted. There's a lot of philosophical discussion about, does something, like, when you say that somebody is selfish, there is like one interpretation of it, but is that really actually the real interpretation of it? Because the collectivist and the objectivist might actually view that in two different ways. So there's a lot of this kind of like discussion going on. And I know that sounds really, really dense, but actually this was an absolutely thrilling novel to follow through with. So I started reading the front page of this in Waterstones the other week and ended up on the second page. And then I was like halfway down the second page and I thought, hey, I may as well actually just buy this because, like, I'm already reading it. And then I just went home and continued with it. And this book is just over 700 pages long. But I finished it in about 5 or 6 days because I was really riveted to this story. So, yeah, I really enjoy stories where we have young people who go into the city and then try to navigate society and build up their careers. I really enjoyed, there's a book called Valley of the Dolls by Jacqueline Susan, and that's set in the 40s and that's done with a group of women, and you really have like this Mad Men feel about it. This one is obviously done post the Great War rather than World War II, but basically we have a bunch of young men who are in New York City who are basically all trying to get on with their profession. And again, this is post-war, so we have like a post-war building boom, and then we have a depression. So it follows that sort of same kind of scenario. And the way that the philosophies are kind of explained in this book, it's not necessarily just through career as well, it's also through their love lives. And I felt like this book, you were constantly on the edge of your seat, despite there being 700 pages. Every 50 to 100 pages is like there's a new sort of thing introduced where you're like, oh my god, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? And like, I really grew attached to the Howard Rourke character. At first, I wasn't really sure what I thought of him, but actually, I was really interested to see how his life unfolded. I can't say that he was the most likable of people, but he was a very interesting character, and I was just really interested to see how how he coped with all the different facets of things. Like, you know, the career bit was kind of obvious, but it was like, how is he actually going to cope with a relationship? How does he cope, you know, with being on the bottom? How does he cope with coming out on top over society? You know, there was like crime in this book, there was affairs, there was love. You know, it just had all the ingredients that you needed for a really, really good story. And I'm telling you a lot. I thought the pacing in this was absolutely excellent. Really, really pulled me along in this book. And this was a bit of a surprise to me because last month I read a book called Anthem by Ayn Rand. And I thought that the writing style was okay, but I thought that the story was really simple. And I didn't mark it that high because I thought that she could have, you know, got a lot more out of that book. Had she sort of really gone into the storyline more. It was only like about a 60-page book, but you know, I felt like it could have been about 300 pages had she really grown the story in the parts where I'd have liked her to, and she didn't. But this is a massive book, and this is absolutely full of all kinds of drama, intellectual discussion, philosophical discussion, political discussion, you know, and it had everything that I needed in it that I didn't even know I wanted at the time when I sat down and read this book. So I know from going on Goodreads that this didn't necessarily get the best reception by everybody, but I personally really, really enjoyed it. It's different from what I normally read, but I really enjoyed it. I actually would score this one a 4.5. I'm not daunted by the fact that it's 700 pages, and I'm actually looking at all her other work now. She has one called Atlas Shrugged, and that was like over 1,000 pages. And I would have been happy if this one was over 1,000 pages. I was sad when this finished because I was enjoying following these characters, and I would have been quite happy to read a few hundred more pages on them. So yeah, I am looking forward to getting some more of her work. Now, what I would say, whilst I wanted to read about these characters, every single character in this book is unlikable. I wouldn't want to be friends with any single one of the characters in this book, but they were really interesting. So I do feel like she delivered a really, really good story. So let me know in the comments down below if you've ever read The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, or have you read anything else by Ayn Rand that you think that I should read next? So yeah, those are the rest of the books then that I read in June that I've not already talked about, sorry, in July, that I've not already talked about in videos. So let me know down in the comments down below what you've been reading this month. Have you read any of those books perchance this month? Or have you read any of those books in the past? Or are they books that you're looking to read in the future? If you've enjoyed this video, please give me the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see my future content, please press the subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye.